when you're teaching chanting scales, tell your students to turn to page 64 and look at chanting scale number 1. Scale number 1 is A flat for everyone except horns, and horns learn E flat first. But again, don't talk to them about transpositions, just tell them to look at chanting scale number 1 on page 64. If they're young, like my students, they often will not use the correct line, and that can lead to a lot of confusion. So take the time to make sure that they're on the correct line. What I do is I have them point to the scale that we're working on and then check their neighbor on each side. And then I also usually go around and spot check a few students that I know have a difficult time with being focused on the correct exercise. So we'll put the students for this type of scale into 3 different groups. Group 1 is clarinet, bass clarinet, tenor sax, trumpet, and horn. You don't have to memorize these groups, they're written down in the book. Horns will be saying the correct pitch names while singing the wrong pitches. It really doesn't make much difference to them at this point, though. They're just learning the scale. Group 2 is flute, oboe, bassoon, trombone, euphonium, tuba, and percussion. And then group 3 is alto and bari sax. When you model, sing while doing the fingerings on an instrument so that the students can see and hear. Keep calling them chanting scales. So I used to call them singing scales, but it really made my students feel uncomfortable. If you sing, then most of the students will sing them back to you without thinking about it, even if you're calling them chanting scales. So try to connect this idea of the chanting scale back to the written scale that hopefully they've already mastered and learned. And the chanting scale is exactly the same as the written scale. It just looks a little bit different on the musical staff. So the written scale looks like this, and then the chanting scale looks like this. Hopefully your students will see that the shape is the same. Just point out that the arpeggio, instead of being circled, is tacked on to the end of the scale. So encourage them to memorize this scale and say, again, don't call it sing, but say it over and over with the metronome on at 66 beats per minute. Stress that they must use the annotated fingerings, because if they'll get them now, then when they're playing the scales really fast, then they won't have to relearn the fingerings to do the best ergonomic fingering. Tell them about the key signature and how to apply it to the specific pitches that are either flat or natural in this scale. They regularly miss the first, fourth, and top pitch. One strategy that's particularly effective for my students is to touch the first flat in the key signature, B flat, with their left index finger, and then touch each pitch in the scale that's now B flat with their right index finger. Then touch the second flat in the key signature, E flat, with their left index finger, and then touch each pitch in the scale that's now E flat with their right index finger. Then touch the third flat, A flat, etc. You get the idea. When teaching this scale, I model the fingerings on one instrument each time we repeat it. So I'll grab a clarinet and say B flat, C, D, E flat, and go through and hold it up so that they can see it, and walk around the room and get as close to each row of clarinets as I can. Also try to get multiple instruments each time that you do the chanting scale. Hopefully you're going to repeat it a few times, especially the first few times. Try to get to most, if not all, of the instruments. You may not be able to get through all the instruments in the 15-minute study period, but like I said, easy way to do this, just borrow that student's oboe, don't put your mouth on it, of course, but then hold up the oboe and show them the fingerings. So you may have to practice a little bit and learn the fingerings yourself so that you have it memorized, but it's well worth your time. We use a technique that I call air and finger. So the students are going to form the mouth shape of blowing a candle and then blow air continuously, not into the instrument, but off to the side. They're going to articulate with their tongue when the music calls for it, and not articulate when it's slurred. So, and then when it comes down the scale, doing the fingers without articulating. If they're a trombone player, you want to make sure that they're being real accurate with the slide positions and looking down to make sure that the slide positions are accurate. If they're a percussionist, you want to make sure their air sticking, which just means that they're not actually hitting the bar, but they're using the correct mallet right above and always starting on their left hand with scales. Every time we do a repetition of a chanting scale, one of the groups is saying the letter names and fingering the correct pitches, going back to those groups we said earlier, group 1, 2, or 3. So group 1 is saying the letter names, and then group 2 and group 3 are airing and fingering while they do that, so you're not hearing two different letter names at the same time. When percussionists are chanting, I tell them to touch the correct bars with their fingers because this increases the tactile feedback of the method. The air sticking helps a lot, but if you can make sure they're touching, and it's also easier for you to see with them touching the keys if they're touching the right keys or not. When they air stick, sometimes they kind of flub it and it's not real accurate. It's hard to see, especially if they're very far like they are in my room from you. So very short, intense bursts of study are more effective for my students. We work on scales for no more than 7 minutes each day. The exception being when I'm teaching a new scale or type of scale. In those days, I'm going to spend about 15 minutes. Like say it's 6th grade's first time learning chanting scales, and I'm probably spend about 15 minutes that day, but not 20 minutes because then I start to lose them. So demand that they say say and finger the correct pitches and point out mistakes that you hear and see every time. Like I said, teach with your eyes. Make sure that you're actually looking at what they're doing and don't only rely on your ears, especially for this part. You're not going to hear the pitches. Their mouth will be making the pitches, but don't be Dr. Doom. Tell them what they're doing well at least twice as much as what they're doing wrong.